Jason Bulmahn, Director of Game Design at Paizo and creator of the Pathfinder role-playing game. In today's Design Musings, I want to talk to you about niche design in your games. In our last video, we talked about asymmetric design and how that engenders kind of team-based games and games where everyone is asked to be cooperative. The thing I didn't really touch on or go too deep into is niche design and how you kind of give each of your rules components their own space to breathe and be their own unique thing within the world. So today I want to talk to you about niche design and how you can use it in your games. So what is niche design? So niche design is, at its heart, a space that you create around a rule for a character or concept to exist kind of without being cluttered or in direct comparison to everything else in the game around it. At its heart, it's a way for a rules element to feel unique and new, different, set apart from the other pieces. I've been doing this for a long time, and niche design became a very important part of the design in the early days of Pathfinder, and it continues to be important to today. And I tend to define most of our design through two different categories of kind of niche design. The first one is story niche, and the second is mechanical niche. So first, I want to talk about story niche a little bit. And story niche really is the part of the rules element that kind of gives the rule context in the wider world that you're trying to create. So it gives the rule a frame for everyone to kind of understand what it is that the rule is trying to be. It's that hook that when you read about it, you go, "Oh, I know what that is. I can imagine that. I can picture what that is, and I know how that fits into my vision of the game world." So take something like probably the cleanest story niche we came up with. We didn't really even come up with it. We just went, yes, obviously that was like the swashbuckler. The moment I say swashbuckler, you automatically picture someone swinging around on ropes, maybe on a ship, maybe through a crowded ballroom, maybe dropping a chandelier on someone, waving a rapier around, throwing out witty repartees, and getting away with the kind of most daring heists with panache and style. Right? So that's a good example of a very strong story niche. It's one word, and the moment I say it, you kind of know what it is. You're not picturing a wizard, you're not picturing a cleric, you're picturing a swashbuckler. Something more important about the story niche too. The story niche informs the mechanical niche. And we'll find out the mechanical niche informs the story niche. But the story niche helps the mechanics make sense. Let's go back to that swashbuckler. I mentioned panache, right? We wrote panache as a feature in the class, the way for them to do daring do. That all of those things come from the story. They're tied to a mechanic that makes sense for what the story and what we all envision it to be is, right? So all of that kind of works together. So you've got story niche. It's really important. All of your major rules elements need to have a good story niche. But you have mechanical niche as well. And in the game environment, this could be just as critical as a story niche. Mechanical niche gives the element a place within the game. It says, this is a unique and interesting expression of some facet of the game. If you think about how wizards work versus how fighters work, they both have very different mechanical niches. One is casting spells, one is being really good at wearing armor and swinging swords. Those are very different mechanical niches. And when we're designing something, we want to make sure that the new elements don't trample all over the mechanical niche of another element, right? That's kind of one of the hardest parts of game design, is figuring out, does this rules element completely supersede another rules element. I think most of you, having played a lot of games over the years, would realize that there are places where this happens. Sometimes it happens unintentionally. Sometimes it's the result of two or three things being put together, and all of a sudden you found a way to supersede something that was supposed to be the benchmark, that was supposed to be the high watermark. And all of a sudden, you've got a power or ability that's even better, right? So sometimes that's you violating the mechanical niche. Um, so a lot of mechanical niche questions are trying to solve various problems, like how do we make a character that's, really, really good at sneaking? We already have one that does that, so we have to be very careful because the direct comparison might hurt us or might devalue one classic rules element over another newer one. It's a big challenge. Mechanical niche is really hard to suss out, and the longer a game exists, the harder that problem becomes. Now, I mentioned that mechanical niche would also inform the story, and it does, because the mechanical niche is how the story is actually expressed. So it's one thing to say, hey, this cleric character has an interesting mechanical niche that it venerates a deity and casts a bunch of divine spells, but until you give it domains that are an expression of that devotion, that are a power flowing directly from that deity, until you explain that divine spells themselves are granted by the deity, the mechanics aren't backing up the story. But once you've done that, now all of a sudden the mechanics and the story start speaking to one another. The story says what the mechanics should be. The mechanics reinforce how the story actually expresses itself in a meaningful way. So those two kind of cycle back and forth and back and forth. And if you're doing it right, you end up with a rules element that people inherently understand the concept, they get what it's trying to do, and they have a sense of what about that concept is right and what about it is wrong. It's one of the big reasons why we play test, to figure out what is right, what is wrong based on those feelings. It's not always about numbers. Sometimes it's just about what your gut says. How do you use niche design in games? How do you do this, right? So I've talked about what the concept is, but I want to get a little bit more practical than that. So let's talk a bit about how we actually employ this concept in our work. Generally speaking, whenever we're designing a rules element, we will look at it through these lenses, through these appearances, right? We'll say, what about this has a good mechanical niche? What about this has a good story niche? Now, not all rules elements are the same. Some require both of these in spades, right? If you look at classes, they are the place that we try to emphasize this the most. We try to make sure that every class that we put out has a very strong mechanical niche and a very strong story niche. These are a character's players entry into the world. This is the vehicle by which they play the game. If that isn't as strong as possible, then they're going to ultimately have an unsatisfactory play experience. Other rules elements aren't as important. So in some cases, they don't need as strong of a mechanical niche or a story niche. I'm thinking like ancestries. They need a really strong story niche, but I'm not sure that they need the strongest mechanical niche in the world. They're an important part of your character, but not as important as class. So in some cases, they can work kind of similar to one another. Spells are kind of the opposite. They need a really good mechanical niche, but their story niche can be a bit blended, right? If you look at spells like, oh, there's a bunch of fire spells in the game. Well, their story niche is all kind of the same, right? They're all spells that shoot fire and deal damage to a lot of targets. But mechanically, they need to work differently so that they're interesting choices and options. But story-wise, a fire spell is a fire spell. If it creates a ball of flame or a cone of flame, ultimately that story is pretty similar. Monsters are an interesting case in this because monsters can kind of go either way. A monster either needs a really good mechanical niche or a really good story niche. I think we find that the best ones that we've ever made have both. But to serve its purpose in the game, sometimes it just needs to be a cool monster that attacks you in interesting ways. That'll make it memorable. In other cases, it needs that strong story because it needs to be able to carry an entire adventure. It needs to be a monster that has enough they're there to be the main villain. You can't exactly do that with something that's just a big dumb animal that charges up and attacks people and throws them around. Might make for a fun fight, might not make for a great story. So it's all about what you need in the game. And you can make those decisions on a case-by-case basis. We certainly do, right? When we're designing monsters or designing spells, we'll kind of make decisions about what this needs to be. And in some cases, it's based on the need of the adventure. In other cases, it's based on the need of the product. A lot of cases, we go to what the need of the end user is, right? What's the need of you? What do you need out of this thing? What do we think you might need out of it? And we try and intuit that and make the best game elements we can. There are, of course, some elements that we create that don't really have a good mechanical niche or a good story niche. That happens. Sometimes you need to fill out a concept. Sometimes it's just like, yeah, this is just, extra smites, right? There's not a great story niche there. The mechanical niche really isn't all that interesting, but it still serves a valuable function of kind of rounding out a play experience or letting the person get more of the thing that they really care about. It enhances and augments another rules element. Those are kind of some of the only places where I'm comfortable being like, yeah, this can just be the thing it needs to be. Something simple, something that gets the job done, but not something that needs to carry heavy weight or grand importance. I think sometimes we can just let an extra feat be an extra feat. So I've talked a bit about how we tend to use this in game. I want to talk a little bit about how we specifically have used this in Pathfinder in the past. Mostly looking at first edition. I think with second edition we're kind of forging the ground all over again. But in first edition, this principle really guided a lot of the class design over the years. Right? We started out with, inheriting a core 11 that were really strong. And really, if you boil that down, you really have 4 super critical classes at the heart of 3.0, 3.5, second edition, first edition, and that's cleric, fighter, rogue, and wizard. Those 4 kind of form the nucleus of most parties and are kind of the easiest, simplest concepts for everyone to grasp. You can tell this because they're the ones that got picked up by all the other video games over the years and have appeared in a multitude of different forms. It's because their concepts are so simple, they're so fundamental. Everything else, all of the other classes, tend to be blends of those. They have their own unique mechanical niches. Some of them are very unique in the story niche, but in some ways they're kind of a blend, right? If you look at a paladin, it's a blend of a fighter and a cleric in some ways. It's got its own thing, it does its own things differently, but at its heart, that's what it's trying to be. A bard is kind of a wizard rogue. Not quite. I mean, that's certainly, if you go back far enough, it's a whole lot of things. But you get what I'm saying. As we went along, as we went further in the design, we started to go further afield. That's the big challenge about managing an existing game line, about managing kind of a game that you're trying to expand and do so in a responsible way. You have to keep finding more and more ways to give those rules elements the space they need to be unique and interesting. I have to say, it wasn't that hard with the Advanced Class Guide, or Advanced Player's Guide, excuse me. That book has the witch in it. I mean, you can't get much more of a simple concept than that. If I say witch, I think everybody immediately conjures an image to their mind. And it wouldn't surprise me if all of our images are pretty similar. Long nose, black hat, maybe green face makeup. Maybe melts with water. But casts spells, rides around on a broom, does witchy kind of things. I think everybody gets that, right? That the story niche there is obvious. The mechanical niche flowed from the story without really too much trouble at all. Hexes were an easy design add. You get into other classes in that book, and most of them fall into that category. There's a few further afield experimentations. The Summoner, has had its fair shake. But you start getting beyond that, and our classes start getting more and more experimental. I think one of the interesting things I want to talk about is the Ninja. The Ninja was one of our early class designs after the Advanced Player's Guide, and the challenge with that class is that we didn't feel that its mechanical niche was strong enough to separate it from the Rogue. Years later, I think we might have pushed harder and made that happen. But at the time, the argument was that the mechanical niche was so close to the rogue that maybe it should just be a subclass of the rogue, kind of like a deep delved archetype, which is what the class ended up being. You can't have levels of rogue and levels of ninja. You only get one or the other. But that solution kind of walls off a lot of doors. For us in our design, that caused more challenges than it was worth. I think we shied away from doing that in the future, primarily because it meant that the ninja now needed all of its own archetypes, and those archetypes needed to be a lot like the rogue archetypes, but not quite the same, which is a problem. Anyway, as the years rolled by and we came out with more and more classes, some of them went further and further afield because you start using up a lot of the easy story niches that are floating around kind of the core concept of a fantasy game, and you start going further and further afield. You start getting, the spiritualists and the vigilante, and you end up kind of running further and further from the center because you are running out of spots. You've covered them, right? It's real easy to come up with a character concept and go, oh, it's obviously just a druid, or oh, that's just a type of cavalier. So it becomes more and more of a challenge to find places to put the rules for the things you want to do with the game. That's a big challenge, and that can be one of the things that leads to you slowly starting to run out of places to do things and start to think about maybe, hey, it might be time to do a new version of this game because we don't have any more places to build that really resonate with people. It's by no means the only reason you do those sorts of things, but it is one of them. It contributes. That said, all of this, if used properly, if you take the niches, if you take that advice to heart and you build the things you're trying to build, if you give them their own place in the story, if you give them their own place in the rules, it really can be a very powerful tool to make the most important parts of your game, in this case classes, express themselves in a way that everyone gets and everyone enjoys. Well, I think that's about all for this topic, talking about niches. If you want to see more videos like this, make sure to like and subscribe. And we'll see you next time.